Trust is a funny thing. It's the invisible thread that holds relationships together, and you don't realize how fragile it is until it starts to fray. For the longest time, I thought my marriage was built on unshakable trust. Sandra and I had been through a lot together, ups, downs, and everything in between. I never imagined that the cracks in our foundation would come from someone as unassuming as our neighbor. Tom lived in the apartment next door. He was the kind of guy you couldn't help but like, always ready with a smile, a friendly wave, or a quick joke in the hallway. Need a ladder? Tom had one. Run out of sugar? Tom was there. He'd pop over a couple of times a week, and it became such a normal part of our routine that I barely thought about it. To me, it seemed like harmless neighborly camaraderie. Sandra and Tom got along particularly well. She'd always had a knack for making people feel at ease, and Tom, who lived alone, seemed to appreciate the warmth she extended to him. I didn't mind. If anything, I was glad we could be a little family-like support system for him. But over time, things started to shift. It was subtle at first. I'd noticed Sandra acting a little more flustered when Tom was around. She'd tidy the living room quickly or adjust her hair before answering the door when he knocked. Sometimes she'd laugh a little too hard at his jokes, her eyes lingering on him just a second too long. First, I brushed it off. Tom was funny, and Sandra was kind-hearted. What was there to worry about? But then, there were the little changes that gnawed at me. Sandra began insisting on entertaining Tom even when I was tired or not in the mood for company. Her excuses were simple: he's lonely, or it's just a quick chat. When I casually asked why Tom seemed to need our company so often, she waved me off with a breezy, "You're overthinking it." The first real warning sign came on a Wednesday. I'd wrapped up my day early and decided to surprise Sandra with dinner at home. As I walked through the front door, the sound of quiet laughter greeted me. There they were, Sandra and Tom, sitting on the couch, far closer than I'd ever seen them. His arm was slung casually over the backrest, and her hands rested lightly on his shoulders. It wasn't overtly romantic, but the intimacy in the scene hit me like a punch to the stomach. "What's going on here?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Sandra practically jumped off the couch, her face flushed. "Oh, you're home early," she stammered, glancing at Tom, who looked equally startled. "Yes, I am. So, what's this?" I gestured vaguely between the two of them, trying to keep my voice steady despite the wave of unease rising in my chest. Sandra's words came out in a hurried jumble. "Tom, his cat. It passed away today. He's devastated." I was just trying to comfort him. I stood there, frozen, trying to process her explanation. Tom's expression mirrored Sandra's. Somber, sheepish, and a little too earnest. A part of me wanted to believe her. It sounded plausible enough. Sandra was nothing if not empathetic, and Tom, well, he looked genuinely upset. So I nodded, deciding to let it go. "Okay," I said, though my tone betrayed my lingering doubts. But things didn't go back to normal after that. Sandra grew distant in the days that followed. She spent more time glued to her phone, her face illuminated by the glow of the screen as she tapped away furiously. I'd walk into the room, and she'd quickly lock her phone, her smile a little too forced as she asked how my day had been. Conversations became surface level, her attention always half elsewhere. She also started excusing herself from our usual routines. "I just need a little alone time," she'd say, heading off to the bedroom with her phone in hand. Or she'd spend long stretches on the balcony, staring out into the night as if searching for something. If I asked what she was doing, she'd shrug and say, "Just clearing my head." Every instinct in me screamed that something was off, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. After all, everyone has moments when they need space. Maybe she was just going through a phase. Still, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the air between us had changed, like a storm was brewing just over the horizon. I tried to bridge the gap between us, suggesting a date night or a weekend getaway. But Sandra always had an excuse. "Work's been crazy," she'd say, or, "Let's plan something for next month." The more I reached out, the more she seemed to pull away. And then there was Tom. He didn't come over as often anymore, but when he did, Sandra's demeanor changed instantly. She'd light up in a way that made my stomach churn, like a teenager with a crush. I told myself it was nothing, that I was being paranoid. But deep down, I knew. I just didn't want to face it. Looking back, I can't pinpoint the exact moment our marriage began to unravel, but the signs were there. Small, almost imperceptible shifts that slowly snowballed into something I could no longer ignore. Sandra and I weren't arguing outright, but the silences between us felt heavier, like unspoken words hung in the air, waiting to burst. It was as if we were speaking two different languages, and neither of us could find the translator. She had always been the glue in our relationship, the one who planned the date nights, sent thoughtful texts during the day, and brought life into every room she entered. But now her energy was elsewhere. First, I chalked it up to stress. Her workload had picked up recently, and she often complained about how drained she felt after long days. I tried to be supportive, offering to take on more household responsibilities and suggesting she take time for herself. But every gesture seemed to land on deaf ears. The distance wasn't just emotional, it was physical. Sandra stopped reaching out for me, stopped sitting close on the couch or holding my hand during movies. Even when I tried to initiate intimacy, there was always an excuse. A headache, exhaustion, or just a curt, "not tonight." I started to feel like a stranger in my own marriage, a guest in what used to be a partnership. Then there were the phones. Hers seemed to be permanently glued to her hand. Sandra had always been active on social media, posting pictures of our dinners or tagging me in funny memes. But now, there were no more shared posts or inside jokes. Instead, she spent hours texting, her face lit by the glow of the screen and a faint, knowing smile. If I asked who she was texting, she'd respond vaguely, "Just a friend," or "work stuff." Once, I caught a glimpse of her locking the phone the second I walked into the room, and the pit in my stomach grew heavier. "Is everything okay?" I finally asked one evening. We were sitting at the dinner table, though it might as well have been a mile apart. "Why wouldn't it be?" she replied, not even looking up from her plate. "I don't know," I said, trying to tread lightly. "You just seem distracted lately," she sighed, finally meeting my gaze. "I've just got a lot on my mind. Work's been overwhelming, and, honestly, I think we both need some space." The word space hit me like a slap. Space. We lived together. How much space did she think we needed? But I swallowed my pride and nodded. "If that's what you need," I said quietly. From then on, things only got worse. She started staying out later, citing errands or after-work drinks with colleagues. When I offered to pick her up or join her, she'd wave me off with a dismissive, "It's just work, people. Nothing fun." The mornings felt colder too. Our usual routine of coffee and idle chatter was replaced with quick goodbyes and awkward silences. I began second-guessing myself, wondering if I was being overly paranoid. Maybe this was just a rough patch. Every couple had them, right? But deep down, a voice whispered that something was wrong, and it grew louder with every passing day. Then came the day that changed everything. It was a Friday, and I managed to wrap up work earlier than expected. I had texted Sandra earlier, but she hadn't responded, which wasn't unusual. Deciding to surprise her, I swung by her favorite bakery on my way home and picked up some pastries. Maybe we could have a quiet evening together and try to reconnect. As I approached our apartment, I noticed something strange. The door wasn't fully shut. It was slightly ajar, the lock unlatched. A chill ran down my spine. Sandra was meticulous about locking the door. She double-checked it every time she left the house. "Hello," I called out, pushing the door open cautiously. The apartment was eerily silent, and my heart pounded in my chest as I stepped inside. The living room was just as we'd left it that morning. The throw pillows neatly arranged, the coffee table clear except for the remote control. I set the bakery bag on the counter, my ears straining for any sound. But there was nothing, no rustle of movement, no sound of running water from the bathroom. Just an unsettling stillness. Support the channel by subscribing. It really makes a difference. "Sandra," I called again, louder this time. No response. I checked the bedroom, empty. The kitchen, silent. Even the bathroom was vacant, the faint smell of her perfume lingering in the air as if mocking my unease. It was as if she had vanished without a trace. I stood in the middle of the apartment, my mind racing with questions. The open door, the silence, none of it made sense. Sandra was supposed to be home, so where was she? I walked back to the living room, my pulse quickening. I stared at the ajar door, the hallway beyond it stretching like a dark, ominous tunnel. I couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something was deeply, irrevocably wrong. I had stepped into an unlocked apartment, but it was empty. Where was my wife? Standing in the silent apartment, I felt paralyzed. The question echoed in my mind. Where was Sandra? The open door was a glaring anomaly, a breadcrumb leading to something I wasn't ready to face. My chest tightened, the weight of unease growing heavier with each passing second. I decided I couldn't just wait for answers to magically appear. I stepped back out into the dimly lit hallway. Our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Novak, was shuffling past with her laundry basket. She was always kind, the kind of person who seemed to know everything happening in the building. If anyone had seen Sandra, it would be her. Mrs. Novak, I called, trying to keep my voice steady. Have you seen my wife? Sandra? The older woman paused, tilting her head slightly as she squinted at me. Your wife? Oh, yes. I saw her just a little while ago. Hope flickered in my chest. Really? Do you know where she went? She ran past me in the hallway, Mrs. Novak said, her tone laced with curiosity. She was heading toward the stairwell. Looked like she was in a hurry. I think, yes, she went up. Toward the roof. The words hit me like a gust of icy wind. The roof? What on earth was Sandra doing up there? I forced a polite smile and nodded my thanks, though my hands were already trembling. I moved toward the stairwell, my legs carrying me faster than my thoughts could keep up. As I climbed the stairs, the chill of the night air seeped through the walls. My breathing quickened, not just from exertion but from the growing knot of dread in my stomach. By the time I reached the final flight, the door to the rooftop loomed ahead, slightly ajar, letting in the faint hum of city noise. I hesitated, my hand on the cold metal handle, before pushing it open. The rooftop was bathed in moonlight, casting sharp shadows across the gravel surface. At first, it seemed deserted, but then I saw movement near the edge, where the faint glow of the city framed two figures. It took my mind a moment to process the scene in front of me. There she was, Sandra, standing with her back to me. She wasn't dressed. No, she wasn't wearing anything except for a cat tail, attached to some kind of waistband, and a mask perched over her face like some absurd parody. Beside her was Tom, equally undressed, his body illuminated by the glow of his phone screen, which he seemed to have just set down on the rooftop gravel. The intimacy between them was undeniable. Their proximity, the way his hand rested on her waist while she leaned closer to whisper something. Every detail screamed betrayal. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear the faint murmur of their voices. The air felt electric, my pulse roaring in my ears as a tidal wave of anger surged through me. Sandra, I barked, my voice slicing through the stillness. They both froze. Sandra spun around, her face partially obscured by the ridiculous cat mask, her eyes wide with shock. Tom turned next, his expression shifting from surprise to something that almost resembled guilt. But not quite. Mark? Sandra stammered, but the words seemed to die in her throat. What is this? I demanded, my voice trembling with a mix of rage and disbelief. What are you doing? Sandra opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Tom, ever the smooth talker, tried to step in. Hey man, this isn't what it looks like, he said, his voice calm in a way that made my blood boil even more. Don't you dare, I growled, stepping closer, my fists clenched. Don't you dare try to explain this away. Sandra took a hesitant step forward, her hands raised as if to placate me. Mark, I can explain. Explain. I cut her off, my voice rising. Explain why I came home to an empty apartment, only to find you like this? On our roof. Tom moved to stand between us, his hands up in a mock gesture of peace. Let's just calm down, all right? We're all adults here. That was it. I lunged forward, my fist connecting with his jaw before he could finish his sentence. He staggered backward, tripping over the gravel, but I didn't care. My focus was on Sandra now. How long? I demanded, my voice hoarse. How long has this been going on? Sandra looked at me, her face pale, tears brimming in her eyes. Mark, please, I'm sorry. Answer me, I shouted. Tom groaned from the ground, clutching his face. All right, it's been a year and a half. Okay? Just stop hitting me. The confession knocked the wind out of me. A year and a half. 18 months of lies, of deception, of her sneaking around while I worked late or trusted her without question. I pulled out my phone, my hands shaking as I pointed it at them. You're going to tell me everything, right now. And I'm recording every word. Sandra hesitated, but Tom was already speaking, his words tumbling out in a desperate attempt to save himself. As he detailed their affair, the stolen moments, the late-night texts, the excuses, I felt like a bystander in my own life, watching everything I'd built crumble into dust. By the time they finished, my hand was steady, though my heart felt like it had been ripped from my chest. And still, the only question echoing in my mind was, how could she do this to me? The rooftop was silent except for Sandra's soft sobs and Tom's groans as he cradled his bruised face. The weight of what I'd just witnessed pressed down on me like a boulder. Every word they'd uttered, every sordid detail they revealed in their desperation, felt like a fresh stab to the heart. My mind screamed at me to stop, to put the phone down and walk away, but I couldn't. I needed proof. Proof that the life I thought I had was a lie. Sandra stood there trembling, clutching the cat tail to her chest like it was some sort of shield against the consequences of her actions. Her mascara streaked down her face, the mask long forgotten on the ground. She looked at me, her eyes pleading, but I felt nothing but a cold, seething rage. Mark, please, she whispered. I know I made a mistake, but don't do this. Don't ruin everything. Ruin everything? I repeated, my voice hollow. Sandra, you already did that. You ruined us. You ruined me. Tom tried to stand, holding up a hand as if to reason with me. Look, man. Don't. I snapped, pointing a finger at him. You don't get to say another word. Not after this. Not ever. He froze, clearly realizing he had no ground to stand on, and sank back down onto the gravel. I stared at Sandra, my wife, the woman I'd built my life with, and felt the last threads of love and trust unravel. You could have told me, I said, my voice quieter now but no less venomous. You could have been honest. Instead, you turned our marriage into some disgusting joke. Her sobs grew louder, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. The betrayal was a wound that demanded action. I opened my phone, saving the video with trembling fingers. Then, with a cold determination I didn't even know I was capable of, I started sharing it. First, her parents, then her siblings, her closest friends, the group chats with our mutual friends. I sent the video to anyone who had ever known Sandra as the loving, caring person she pretended to be. Mark, no, Sandra screamed, lunging toward me, but I stepped back, avoiding her grasp. You wanted to sneak around in the dark, I said, my voice ice cold. Now the world gets to see what you've been doing. No more lies, Sandra. No more secrets. She fell to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably, her hands clutching at my pant leg. Please, Mark, please don't do this. I'll do anything. I'll fix it. Just don't send it to my mom. She'll never forgive me. I looked down at her, a mix of disbelief and disgust twisting in my gut. You should have thought about that before you dragged my name, our marriage, and everything we built through the mud. This is on you, Sandra. You did this. By the time I finished, the video had reached everyone who mattered. It was done. There was no taking it back. Sandra's sobs grew quieter as the reality of what I'd done sank in. Tom just sat there in stunned silence, his face pale and slack, likely realizing that he wasn't going to escape the fallout either. I didn't feel triumphant. If anything, I felt hollow, like I'd sacrificed a piece of my soul just to make sure the truth came out. But there was no going back now. Over the next few days, the fallout was swift and brutal. Her parents called me first, her mother's voice thick with tears. "Mark, I'm so sorry. We didn't raise her to be this way." I don't know what to say. Her father, ever the stern man, was less forgiving. "She's dead to me," he said simply before hanging up. Sandra's siblings followed suit, each one expressing shock and disbelief. Her friends, those who had once envied our relationship, were quick to cut ties. No one wanted to associate with the person they now saw in the video. At work, word spread like wildfire. A colleague who'd seen the video sent me a message, saying, "She's a laughingstock here, Mark. No one can believe it." Sandra called me endlessly, leaving tearful voicemails begging me to talk, to undo what I'd done. But I didn't answer. Couldn't. The last time I saw her was a week later. She showed up at the apartment, her face gaunt and tired, her once bright eyes dull. She stood in the doorway, clutching a box of belongings I'd left out for her. "I've lost everything," she said quietly, her voice breaking. I nodded, my expression unreadable. "You made your choices, Sandra. Now you live with them." She looked at me one last time, as if hoping for a shred of forgiveness, but I had none left to give. She turned and walked away, disappearing down the hallway, and with her went every ounce of love and trust I'd ever felt. In the weeks that followed, I started piecing my life back together. It wasn't easy. The betrayal left scars that would take years to heal, but I took solace in knowing that the truth was out. Sandra had ruined my world, but she'd also destroyed her own, and that, somehow, felt like justice. Support the channel by subscribing. It really makes a difference.